What's up, Dune fans, and welcome back to the channel. Are we all getting hyped for Dune Part 3 yet? Or is Dunesday catching your eye a little more? As we all know, Denis Villeneuve's Dune films are critically acclaimed, and more than that, they're considered pretty faithful, which isn't always the case with book adaptations. Is that reputation earned, though? Well, if you ask us, yeah. However, faithful doesn't always mean identical. What I mean by that is that across parts 1 and 2 of Dune, entire characters have lost their book roles or vanished outright. Time jumps get deleted, and one of the novel's most controversial endings is rewritten to turn a main character into a fundamentally different person. Now, mind you, Villeneuve isn't being careless or disrespectful. Every one of those changes is a very deliberate one, deciding to swap Frank Herbert's dense and sometimes downright bizarre narrative for something you can, actually shoot on camera. That's why today, we're going to break down the biggest changes across both films, and we're going to dive into David Lynch's wild 1984 version just a little as a point of comparison, and figure out why each of these calls was made. And before you ask, it's up to you to decide whether these changes were the right call or not. Alia Atreides gets put on ice. Here's the biggest change, which is actually something non-book readers would never see coming because the book version is just that weird. You see, in Herbert's novel, the final act jumps forward exactly 2 years, and in that gap, Lady Jessica gives birth to Alia, Paul's little sister. As you may already know, Jessica drank the water of life while pregnant, and this makes Alia preborn, by which I mean there's a 2-year-old toddler walking around with the ancestral memories and intellect awakened through Jessica's water of life ordeal. The Fremen find her terrifying, and for good reason, and they even have a word for what she is: abomination. That's because a child who carries thousands of adult egos inside her is, by the Bene Gesserit's own doctrine, a walking catastrophe waiting to happen. She might be just a toddler, but she's essential in that final part of the book, moving calmly through the chaos, unnerving hardened soldiers, and it's exactly this specific kind of wrongness that Herbert wants this character to make people feel. But then, it seems Villeneuve has deleted that time jump entirely, condensing the entire sequel into less than 9 months directly following Part 1. Co-writer John Spates explained that a long time jump would cool the passions of Part 1, making Leto's death and the character's emotional wounds feel less immediate. Cutting the time gap isn't really about delaying Alia, but it maintains the rush of Paul's journey, a young man swept along by events faster than he can process them, which is the exact tragic momentum the films want to show. Plus, you gotta remember, Alia is a talking, omniscient toddler. Can you imagine what a nightmare that would have been to film and how derailing it would have been for the movie? Genuinely, I wouldn't be surprised if it ruined the immersion of the Duneverse completely. Spates said the team feared that a talking toddler would become a distraction and would be difficult to execute convincingly on film. So, rather than risking the whole climax tipping over into something ridiculous, he simply moved her off stage. That's why in Part 2, Alia never appears as a proper character. Jessica instead communicates with her unborn daughter telepathically, the fetus speaking to her from the womb. That's creepy and uncanny in its own way, so it works well as a clever workaround. The unborn Alia effectively becomes Jessica's silent confidant, whispering strategy about how to win the Southern Fremen over, and it lets the film use Jessica's visibly growing pregnancy as a ticking clock instead of a title card. That said, we do get one glimpse of Alia out of the womb. It's her grown up and played by Anya Taylor-Joy during a vision Paul has after drinking the water of life. This is essentially a cameo, but it planted seeds for the future, since Alia is a major player in Dune Messiah, and Villeneuve has confirmed Taylor-Joy returns as a properly grown Alia in Part 3.
I swear to you I wasn't aware of any of this.
Actually kills the Baron. Okay, so the biggest consequence of cutting Alia from Part 2 is related to Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. In the novel, it's actually Alia who kills the Baron, because she was captured and brought before him because she was the most dangerous toddler in the galaxy. She jammed him with a Gom Jabbar and taunted him as he died about meeting the Atreides Gom Jabbar. A murderous toddler assassinating the big bad is one of the book's most infamous freakish beats, and somehow it works. Part of the reason that kill is thematically perfect is that the Baron is murdered by his own granddaughter, who's also part of the poisoned Atreides legacy. Who doesn't love that kind of grim symmetry? The monster undone by the very bloodline he tried to exterminate. Well, we know Frank Herbert does. Again, you can imagine how weird and uncanny this would have been with a 2-year-old assassin, and since movie Alia is still in the womb, it meant this job would fall to Paul. So in Part 2, he storms the Imperial confrontation, and after learning that the Baron is secretly his grandfather, stabs him in the throat with the line, "Grandfather, you die like an animal." Book Alia killing the Baron is a shock moment, and it's about fate closing a loop. Movie Paul killing him is about his corruption, foreshadowing the turn Paul will take in the future. Sure, it might be about avenging his family, but it's also about embracing the ruthless Harkonnen blood he's just discovered running in his veins. The film also adds a visual that isn't in the book at all. The Baron's corpse left out in the open with a lingering shot of an ant crawling across his ear. That image might remind David Lynch fans of the ant-covered ear in Blue Velvet, although no deliberate reference has been confirmed. The Mentats get benched. In the book, Mentats are human beings trained to think like supercomputers, since the Butlerian Jihad outlawed machines made in the likeness of a human mind. And they're everywhere. Paul himself secretly receives Mentat training, which sharpens his strategic mind before he ever embraces the prophecy. Which means, yup, Book Paul is partly a product of elite conditioning, a boy engineered from several directions at once. The Bene Gesserit through his mother, the Mentats by his father's staff, plus he's a ducal heir by blood. Now that's an all-rounder. His status as Chosen One is deeply reliant on a lifetime of deliberate training, which makes his rise feel earned as much as fated. The films, however, almost erase the Mentats. Peter de Vries, the sadistic Harkonnen Mentat played by David Dashalmain, is killed off in Part 1. He appears in several brief scenes, but the film gives viewers very little explanation about what a Mentat is, so casual audiences might not even realize what's going on with him. Then there's Thufir Hawat, Paul's own Mentat, played by Stephen McKinley Henderson, who gets a diminished role in Part 1 and then vanishes completely in Part 2. That's actually another change because in the novel, Hawat has a whole subplot to himself and it's pretty tragic. After the Harkonnen attack, he's captured and forced to serve the Baron as his replacement Mentat, but is secretly working against his captors. Thufir ultimately dies rather than betraying House Atreides. Henderson actually filmed scenes for Part 2, including some with Christopher Walken's Emperor, but Villeneuve cut them. In the long run, it's not the sort of change that will have much impact, but for me, when it comes to the short run, I think my boy Thufir was sorely underused. Liet-Kynes dies a completely different death. Perhaps you're already aware that in Herbert's original novel, Liet-Kynes was a man, which is another change. In the book, he's an imperial planetologist who has gone over to the natives. He's secretly one of the Fremen's most influential leaders, serving as their hidden ecological, religious, and political organizer, and even more importantly, he's Chani's father. His death comes about after he's betrayed and abandoned in the open desert with no stillsuit and water, and he's hallucinating conversations with his dead father before dying in a pre-spiced thermal explosion. It's pretty much a textbook example of a slow and philosophical ending. Villeneuve gender-swapped the character. Sharon Duncan Brewster plays Kynes in Part 1, and he also gave her a final scene where she goes out in a blaze of glory. Cornered by the Sardaukar, she summons a sandworm and lets it devour her and her would-be killers in one last defiant act of sacrifice. Love it or hate it, you can't deny that the scene had style and made for a far more cinematic exit. Another thing that the films drop is the family connection. Although Book Kynes is Chani's father, the films never establish any familial relationship between their versions of Kynes and Chani. This removes one of the book's most important bloodlines. It's a small loss on screen, but it means an entire generational link in the Fremen leadership just evaporates. Movie Chani is no longer the daughter of the planet's most important figure, which subtly lowers her book status even as the films raise her prominence in other ways. Chani's ending, so far, is the biggest rewrite. Continuing on with the Chani changes, if you remember just one change from this video while going into Dune Part 3, make sure it's this one. In the novel, Chani accepts Paul's politically necessary marriage to Princess Irulan with grace that is as remarkable as it is baffling. She remains his beloved concubine, and Jessica reassures her with one of the book's most famous lines, that history will remember them, the concubines, as wives, and Irulan will be left with nothing but the title. This whole side plot is definitely bittersweet, but it's meant to ultimately be reassuring. Paul loves Chani, everyone knows it, and the political marriage is a hollow formality. The book more or less tells the reader not to worry about it. Villeneuve definitely worried about it though, because the film changes that ending completely. Movie Chani definitely feels betrayed, not just because Paul took Irulan's hand, but because he's become the colonizing messiah he swore he'd never be. There's no reassuring speech from Jessica, no "history will call us wives." Instead, there's just Zendaya's face, furious and heartbroken, as she turns her back on the man she loves fully aware of the holy war he's about to unleash. So Chani's ending in Part 2 is walking away before she summons her own Sandworm and rides off alone into the desert. It's not a removal like most of the previous entries, it's a complete reinvention that gives Zendaya a much stronger arc instead of the supporting wife role that Chani mostly played in the novels. This sets up a very different Dune Part 3. Zendaya is confirmed to return as Chani, but the films have deliberately left her future relationship with Paul altered and unresolved. Sadly, we're gonna have to wait until December to find out how that plays out. Chani the Skeptic is a pure movie invention. Don't worry, this is our last Chani-focused change, but how could we not talk about this? It's so important to not just her character, but to Paul's as well. In the book, Chani is a staunch believer. By the time Paul reaches Sietch Tabor, there isn't the kind of organized ideological opposition to the prophecy that the films introduce, and Chani is no different. She's devoted to Paul pretty early on. The films flip this belief completely, and she instead becomes the movement's leading skeptic. When Jessica's survival of the Water of Life is offered as proof of the prophecy, movie Chani snaps back because she sees the Messiah myth for exactly what it is, a control mechanism, arguing that if you want to control people, one of the easiest ways to do that is to convince them a Messiah will come. That's because the team behind the movies wanted to focus more on a debate the novel doesn't go into much, by which I mean the tension between blind faith and self-determination, where Chani stands for the latter and Stilgar for the former. Javier Bardem's Stilgar becomes a true believer, who reads every little coincidence as scripture, and it's too easy to see him as comic relief or a fun character to make memes of, but he's also a chilling portrait of how fanaticism spreads and shapes society. Chani, on the other hand, is his mirror image, taking the role of a rationalist watching her people get swept up in a myth. The idea to use two prominent characters to show this divide is frankly way more compelling than one short voiceover of Paul agonizing or having a mild existential crisis. The films lean hard into the idea that the so-called prophecy is manufactured, that it's really a product of the Bene Gesserit's Missionaria Protectiva, which is their program for putting superstitions into primitive worlds so they can be later exploited. Dune is frequently read as a critique of colonial savior narratives, and the films make that interpretation even more explicit. Herbert's clearest documented intention, though, was to warn readers about charismatic and messianic leaders. Herbert wanted the book to warn against allegedly messianic figures, and Villeneuve's writing leans hard into exactly that. The weirding way disappears. Okay, I've waited long enough. Now it's time for our first comparison to the 1984 Dune film. But first, the book, because it always begins with the book. In Dune, the weirding way is a martial art. It's a fighting technique of the Bene Gesserit, rooted in prana bindu muscle and nerve control, which allows someone skilled in the art to move and strike at almost impossible speeds. It was never a weapon that shoots sound, and that's where the 1984 film comes into play because that was David Lynch's invention. According to a frequently repeated production anecdote, Lynch felt the weirding way would be difficult to translate directly to the screen, so he replaced it with what he called weirding modules, which, as we mentioned, are sonic beam weapons that translate specific spoken sounds into attacks. This is why, in the 1984 film, Paul Fremen's name, Muad'Dib, literally becomes the killing word that fires the device, which is about as on the nose as you can get about future foreshadowing, to be honest. Because in the book, that killing word phrase is symbolic. It's about the Holy War unleashed in his name. And then we have Villeneuve, who removes the weirding way as a named subplot while retaining the Bene Gesserit's extraordinary physical abilities and combat skills. No sound weapons, no sandy kung fu. Instead, his films use grounded, physical fight choreography and visual storytelling, which suits the vibe his directing brings to the franchise much better. His Atreides and other Imperial fighters use the shield fighting technique from the book, that slow blade piercing the shield rhythm, while the Fremen generally fight unshielded in the desert because shields attract sandworms. The difference between the two approaches is clear. Where Lynch relied heavily on voiceover internal monologue so audiences could hear every character's thoughts, Villeneuve lets acting, choreography, staging, and music carry the subtext. Feyd-Rautha, from schemer to slasher. In the novel, Feyd-Rautha is a scheming Harkonnen heir with a very complex arc, which is mostly all political. He plots assassination attempts against his own uncle, encouraged by Thufir Hawat, while the Baron grooms him in his own long con, planning to install the hateful Beast Rabban on Arrakis first, so Feyd can later arrive as the beloved savior. He's a clear mirror to Paul, He's also used to fighting under carefully controlled conditions. In the arena, his opponents are usually manipulated or drugged, and his blades are poisoned, and during his final duel with Paul, he carries a concealed poisoned hip spur. Paul even knows a Bene Gesserit command word that could immobilize Feyd, but refuses to use it. Also, Feyd isn't bald in the book either. He's described as dark-haired, serving as Paul's genetic and thematic counterpart rather than looking exactly like him. Part 2, with Austin Butler completely bald beneath striking pale makeup, doesn't change the gladiatorial spectacle, that stunning black and white Getty Prime arena sequence, or the climactic duel with Paul. But what it does do is trim a lot of the political maneuvering, and it's because movie Feyd is a charismatic sadist, not really a political schemer. He's still Paul's dark mirror, another young man raised to be a weapon, pointed in the opposite moral direction, but Villeneuve's Feyd-Rautha is primarily a psychotic threat in a physical way. Butler really sinks his teeth into the role and plays him as a purring, unpredictable predator rather than a calculating politician, kind of villain who's frightening because you have no idea what he's going to do next, not because he's 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Honestly, that's just as intriguing, even if it's completely different from the book. Also, something interesting is that the film removes both Feyd's concealed poisoned hip spur and Paul's opportunity to use the Bene Gesserit command word, making the final duel feel less explicitly rigged and more dangerous. Oh, and the Baron's plan with Raban is basically a throwaway moment where Feyd just gets promoted when Raban fails to control Arrakis. Riding the worm becomes the main event. If you're listing standout scenes in the movies, I bet the bit about Sandworm riding is a strong contender. But did you know in the book, Paul's first Sandworm ride is a rite of passage that's handled much more briefly? Herbert explains how maker hooks steer a worm, but gives comparatively little practical detail about how Paul reaches, mounts, and physically survives the initial ascent. Villeneuve expands that material into one of Part 2's biggest set pieces, devoting a huge sequence to Paul summoning and mounting a worm using maker hooks and a thumper, with the assembled Fremen watching to see whether Shai Hulud accepts him or kills him. The older Fremen even bet on whether he'll survive, because here, it's an uber-important and, in fact, essential coming-of-age trial. Also, Hans Zimmer's score absolutely soars during this scene, making it one of my favorites, and Villeneuve has actually called it his favorite scene too, openly admitting that it's barely described in the book, so he had to imagine the nitty-gritty mechanics of it. And Chalamet described it as Paul's true coming of age because there are such stakes. Failure means not only death, but also the collapse of his prophesized status. It was a 44-day shoot requiring a dedicated worm unit. Yup, it was literally called the worm unit, as well as multiple rigs. It's maybe not the biggest change from the novels, but it is the clearest example of the film's overall strategy. Pick a moment the novel races past and give it the operatic weight Dune's expansive lore deserves. Jessica's transformation gets streamlined and weaponized. The scenes where Jessica drinks the water of life made me seriously tremble in both the book and the movie. The book devotes a lot of time to the process. The whole thing, converting the poison, merging with the memories of all past Reverend Mothers, and grappling with the psychic toll, plus the consequence that she's simultaneously awakened unborn Alia in her womb, that gets a lot of attention. The film, as they do with many extended sequences, compresses the ritual into a much tighter scene, with the visuals and acting doing most of the work. But that's not all. Villeneuve doesn't just reduce something here, he adds something that wasn't in the book at all. In Part 2, Jessica becomes an active missionary, and she's sent south, spreading the Lisan al-Gaib prophecy among the more devout Fremen, converting believers one by one, alongside her unborn daughter's whispered guidance. Now, you can call her a propagandist too, that just depends on how you see the prophecy. The film takes this much further than the book. Jessica already understands and uses the Missionaria Protectiva traditions in Herbert's novel, but Villeneuve turns her into a far more active political architect, deliberately spreading Paul's legend among the southern Fremen. In the film, Jessica becomes a far more aggressive propagandist and political architect, using a prophecy she knows was planted while increasingly embracing Paul's exceptional status. You could even read Rebecca Ferguson's performance as a gradual slide towards fanaticism, which makes for one of the film's most chilling character arcs. Princess Irulan loses her superpower. In the novel, Princess Irulan is a plot device before she's ever a character. She doesn't actually appear in person until the very end, but nearly every chapter opens with an epigraph, which is always an excerpt from her future in-universe writings, from texts like Manual of Muad'Dib and A Child's History of Muad'Dib. These little quotations constantly remind you that the story is being recorded as history, while also providing historical context, creating dramatic irony and showing how Paul's legend is shaped through Irulan's later writings. Also, crucially, they spoil his fate, which is on purpose, so you read the whole book being totally aware of the tragic inevitability that is Paul's journey. It's one of Herbert's most distinctive tricks, and it's damn effective. The films change that by giving the opening narration, something that might have belonged to Irulan, to Chani instead, immediately establishing the story from a Fremen perspective. Florence Pugh's Irulan does show up in Part 2, and the film absolutely hints at her future role as chronicler. She's shown recording her observations into a journal/recorder, and she does narrate parts of the film, but her on-screen role is comparatively more restrained and mysterious. She records events, advises her father, and observes Paul's rise, with Paul's proposal at the climax becoming one of her defining moments. Little remains of her literary function, although hopefully the journal is a hint at a bigger and more book-accurate role in Part 3. The politics get simplified. I mean, this was kind of inevitable. Herbert's Dune is jam-packed with political machinery that runs the galaxy. The Landsraad is an assembly of great houses that checks the Emperor, the Spacing Guild and its total monopoly on interstellar travel via spice-fueled navigators is essential, the Chom economic combine is endlessly complicated, and the maneuvering between these factions is endless. You just can't put all of that into a movie unless you're making a documentary, so the films focus almost entirely on the Atreides-Harkonnen-Fremen triangle. The Guild is barely dramatized in Villeneuve's films. Representatives appear briefly, eyeliners are visible, but we never actually see one of the mutated guild navigators like we do in Lynch's version. Villeneuve was upfront about this sacrifice, saying he chose to embrace just one aspect of the book, which was the Bene Gesserit plotline, which obviously is the most essential of the lot. That meant other elements fell away, but I don't think it hurt the film's world building at all. Also, the mechanism of Paul's final power play changes. In the book, he threatens to destroy all spice production forever, which is blatantly shocking in its audacity because it would cripple the Guild, the Emperor, and the Sisterhood in one stroke. It's an ultimatum that spans the whole damn galaxy. In the film, Paul first threatens the Emperor by declaring he's willing to use the Atreides atomics against the spice fields on Arrakis. When the Great House later refuses to recognize his rule, he orders the Fremen to attack them instead. It's a much more immediate conflict and far easier to visualize on screen. Another noteworthy change is the Emperor's expansion. In the novel, Shaddam IV only appears at the very end with Irulan, whereas Christopher Walken's Emperor gets a bigger role in Part 2. Paul even forces him to come to Arrakis rather than the Emperor arriving for his own ends. Like, if that doesn't show just how much power and reputation Paul has already amassed, what could? How 1984 did it all differently. Last, but definitely not least, it's our main event, which actually could be a whole video on its own. David Lynch's 1984 Dune film made its first and not final error when it tried to cram the entire first novel into a single film. Lynch was also separately developing a sequel based on Dune Messiah, but those plans never came to fruition. The result has been famously criticized. It literally opens with an exposition-heavy scene in which Virginia Madsen's Irulan narrates the setup directly to the camera like she's in the office. And then, the third act is so rushed that entire armies rise and fall in minutes. I mean, kudos for trying, but it's just not good. The film was widely criticized for being confusing, with many critics and viewers struggling to follow its dense storytelling. Lynch has spent decades distancing himself from the finished film, saying the experience was deeply painful because he never had Final Cut control. What I'd give to see Lynch's original version, because almost all of his other work is fantastic, and nobody in this century can hold a candle to him when it comes to surrealist filmmaking. It's little wonder that Villeneuve, who's seen Lynch's film, decided to split a single book into two nearly 3-hour films. For Villeneuve, splitting the novel into 2 films gave the story room to breathe, while Lynch, unfortunately, had to strangle too many scenes for lack of time. And when it comes to the visuals, there's intense contrast between the two directors' styles. Lynch's sandworms open their mouths like flower petals with 3 triangular lips, while Villeneuve's are sharper prehistoric tunnels lined with countless teeth. Lynch's Baron Harkonnen, played by Kenneth McMillan, is a bizarre cackling monster covered in weeping boils and floating around leering. Skarsgård's Baron is more of a quiet predator, still and calculating while remaining a grotesque caricature. Lynch's Arrakis is a baroque yet grimy fever dream that makes you squint because you're overstimulated. Villeneuve's is fast, tidy, and brutal. It's like if Lawrence of Arabia suddenly pivoted into science fiction. And, as we mentioned, Lynch famously buried his film in internal monologue voiceovers, letting us hear every character's thoughts, where Villeneuve did the opposite, stripping away the narration to let the acting and visuals and soundtrack do the talking for us. Oh, also, in Lynch's ending, Paul makes it literally rain on Arrakis, which basically confirms him as a real magic messiah, which is obviously found nowhere in the book, and it's also the complete opposite of Villeneuve's Part 2, which is deliberately unsettling and anti-messianic. To be fair, Lynch also includes toddler Alia, and it's, well, weird to say the least, and not in the way the book intends for it to be. If anyone here actually prefers Lynch's version, absolutely no judgment on my part, but I'd love to hear why in the comment section down below. This is a safe space, guys, don't worry. But that said, clearly changes were made, but for very different reasons. Villeneuve regularly trades the book's interior complexity and expansive politics for visual clarity and emotional payoff. None of his changes betray Herbert's world, unlike a lot of other adaptations which seem to actively hate their source material. Villeneuve just alters some stuff a little for the screen while also doing work for future storylines, like, for example, Chani's walkout. That change will have a major impact on Dune Part 3, adapting Dune Messiah and hitting theaters on December 18th this year. So, which of these changes bothered you the most, and which ones are you on board with? Let us know in the comment section down below, but otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.